Corporation, which is a leading provider of specialized ISO-refrigerated containers and generator sets in the world. Klinge is an original equipment manufacturer with headquarters located in York, Pennsylvania, and an engineering and sales office in Denmark. As a world-class innovator in the transport refrigeration industry, the Klinge Group provides superior transport container solutions for a variety of industries, including chemical, oil and gas, pharmaceutical, food processing, and military customers. Their container refrigeration units are built to the highest standards and made to hold up under tough conditions, which has made them an ideal fit for military and government use, as well as for commercial applications. And their customized designs offer customers robust alternatives to the standard mass-produced refrigerated containers, which often can't meet the requirements of harsh environments or stringent testing. So, Allan, thanks for joining us on the podcast today.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, no problem. So listen, I know being a graduate of both Harvard and Dartmouth, I know you're not a stranger to excellence, but from anybody who's watched from the outside, I think the growth and innovation that you've led during your time at Klinge is somewhat of a masterclass for anybody who's paying attention there. So why don't we start out a little bit by you giving us maybe a bit of a history around the company and how you guys have grown to where you're at right now.
Yeah, gladly. So we originally started as agents for York International in Denmark. So at that time, my father and grandfather, I'm a third generation company leader here. We're working closely with companies like Maersk Lines and some of their initial, efforts into the refrigerated container space. So to transport usually food products like bananas, meat, things like that. And did a lot of the work for York at that time. And eventually were then offered the opportunity to buy the division here for marine transport in York, Pennsylvania. So that's how we ended up coming from Denmark to York itself. And that allowed us then in '84 to move into the space on the York campus. Eventually in '86 we moved out. '91 we moved to our current location, and we've been here ever since. So growing that business from a focus kind of on standard refrigerated equipment for, like I said, more standard food product transport to really specialized refrigeration company. So we're providing equipment that goes on the shipping containers you typically see at the port stacked up for all sorts of different, typically non-food products. So dangerous goods, pharmaceuticals, where we develop equipment also for bulk liquid transport. So that would be, let's say, 24,000 liter, nearly 6,000 gallon tanks that are used for transport of, again, a lot of chemical products, but also sometimes milk or beer, orange juice concentrate, things like that. And we have,
stuff, right? Yeah.
What's that?
I said the important stuff, right?
Yeah.
Milk and the beer.
But so we work in that space, and we work in a few different other niche industries, including the offshore market, some food processing equipment, stationary equipment. But we try to really target, and the growth has largely come from finding these applications where there's not a lot of coverage, right? So we look and we analyze and say, where's there a gap, or where do we see regulatory change coming down the pike that will allow us to kind of be there at the right time, the right place with a product that we've already developed. So I think that's where a lot of our growth has come in, and because of that, we've been able to continue to move the company forward, and we've also been able to keep bringing new people on board, develop new products, and constantly innovating in those spaces that we operate in.
And I think that's probably great evidence of that is you had a fantastic product ready to go when the unexpected happened with the pandemic, right? So I think maybe you can talk about the pharmaceutical industry has been one of those areas I think you've seen a lot of growth in over the last couple of years. And certainly part of that is because you could see that forward thinking of, hey, where do we need to have products that can serve the needs? And obviously when kind of a black swan event like that ends up occurring, you're already positioned to take advantage of that market. But maybe just talk about, you have incredible capabilities around how cold your containers can go, right? I think it's negative 70 Celsius. What's that? Negative 94 Fahrenheit.
Yeah, I mean, we certainly, that is a very good example. We had looked around 2015 or so, we were coming off of doing a few good years of sales in the offshore market, where we had oil and gas products that were explosion proof. So they would go on an oil rig, they might have an explosive gas environment, and they needed to store paint, food, or medical supplies on those FPSOs, or the oil rigs themselves. And with that market, there is an up and down in the oil price market, as everybody knows and sees at the pump. Around 2015, we saw a pretty severe downward trend occurring, And we said, well, our whole goal is to build up multiple niches across multiple markets, so we don't have a specific pressure across all our markets at one time, and we can keep moving the company forward, as I mentioned. At that time, we saw that there was a trend occurring within the pharmaceutical industry where folks were looking to say, how can we move out of our typical air transport paradigm? So how can we get out of doing everything that we ship by air, which is pretty expensive, of course, but it's also pretty bad for the environment. So, to move 1 kilo of product 1 kilometer, you have on the order of 30 degrees more CO2 emissions when you transport that kilo of product by air. So there was some pretty serious, considerations around that time, especially within the EU and then and other locations as well. To how do we make that transition maybe to go to ocean freight? And we started to see the questions. We started to see, the presentations at conferences and things like that that were indicating that this was really where the market was heading. And so we set out to basically decide, how could we support that market? And we had a lot of lessons from the dangerous goods space that we worked in, where we built equipment that was dual redundant with backup power, remote monitoring, all sorts of things to make sure that certain products that might otherwise, have a severe incident or reaction, I should say, to not being properly cooled would always be properly cooled, would have backup systems, and would certainly have notification processes in place for when things went wrong. And we said, well, that's a perfect set of standard operating procedures, and we have the relationships with the steamship lines, which, believe it or not, they're still called steamship lines. None of them are using.
I haven't updated the terminology.
But at the same time, we said this is really, somewhere where we can excel, and we can try to provide that same set of redundancy and reliability, but for different reasons, right? To make sure the patients are getting what they need first and foremost, but also to allow these companies to basically reduce their costs, improve their CO2 emissions, and kind of improve global CO2 emissions, or reduce global CO2 emissions. So in that space, we developed a few different product lines, but one of them was a dual redundant system going down to minus 70 Celsius, and that really became for us in the years leading up to 2020 a product that was being used, more and more here and there for biologics, for other high value products, but then really exploded into the space when, of course, the pandemic came along, and there was a need for ultra low temperature storage. And it wasn't always minus 70, sometimes it was minus 40, but somewhere in that space, they were also being used, not just in the storage application or transport application, but in the actual production of product. So to bring a product down past a certain, what's called glass transition point, to allow the product then to achieve the final state that it needed to be in for shipment. So we were able to respond fairly quickly in that space, and to deliver a lot of equipment out to help respond to the COVID-19 pandemic. So we were very proud of that, and the folks here were very proud of it. And it felt good to be doing something, as one of these critical industries, during that time, that we really could very easily point to and say, hey, we're making a difference. So
I'll tell you, it's always nice when businesses always are taking a bit of a risk or a gamble or a bet when you say, okay, we think this is where it's going. Let's think the resources, people, and time into this. And when that actually pays off in that way, I'm sure that does feel like a great win for everybody, especially when you're doing good for both the environment and for your customer base, right? And
yeah.
Ultimately, that funnels down to the customers of the pharmaceutical companies as well. So, maybe touch base on, we have seen in the intermodal space the last couple of years, it was a huge peak, I'll say, in terms of people who were moving intermodal containers, more the trucking industry. And then that kind of had a significant correction, we'll say, that now maybe they're starting to see a little bit. Have you guys had any impact as a result of that? I know you've had more product sales, we'll say, probably, and more customers who are adopting the technology that you guys are putting out there. Has that helped lessen some of the constraints on trying to get shipments in and out, just because that demand overall in the intermodal market has dropped, and now, time to delivery have you seen that change, I guess, and speed up for you guys, or has it been fairly consistent all through?
There were definitely bottlenecks in the delivery of equipment around the world, I would say, right? So everybody saw the ship sitting off the West Coast. Everybody heard about the issues in the Suez Canal. Everybody kind of knew all these things were compounded on top of each other, and so there were kind of two things that happened. One is there was on top of everything that was going on, the pandemic response. people were sitting at home, they were ordering more consumer goods, there was more products being shipped all around the world, more food products being delivered, right? And not necessarily folks going to the grocery store. But at the same time, we saw this global kind of bottleneck everywhere, right? Where containers couldn't get where they needed to go. They would have perhaps a port shut down because of COVID cases. Things like that happened fairly consistently during the pandemic, and they just basically everything went slower. So everything went slower, and then people then again also bought more containers. So there's more containers that went out into circulation, but they were still moving slowly. So what we've seen in the last 2 years really is a more normalized supply chain network, and that has happened in part because things have just gotten easier in terms of not having all these COVID restrictions, but also because there was really a kind of influx of equipment that went out there, right? Especially on the temperature controlled equipment that we typically work with, to help with the bottlenecks and supply chain issues and everything. So it has definitely normalized. Rates have come back down, to easily, under half of what they were at the height of the pandemic, where people were paying exorbitant rates to ship, very simple products. But we still have issues going on now that impact global trade, like the Red Sea security issues that are continuing to kind of plague a lot of the shipping lines and drive, 2 to 3 week longer delivery times around Africa, between Europe and Asia, for example, between the U.S. and Asia.
Yeah.
So those still are there. There's still some pains in trying to figure out how to make this whole thing work. But hopefully we get to a better place here in the next few years with some joint security efforts between multinational forces as well to help keep that moving smoothly. So.
Yeah, well, and it's probably more important for people than ever to have access to some of your systems as well, especially your dual redundant system. When you think about, hey, if things are going to potentially be delayed, or if there was an issue with another type of model where, hey, we don't have that, if we need to protect that precious cargo, we can feel confident that we have a model that's going to have an alternative if we have an issue with the primary source. So.
Yeah, and most of our systems are traveling not only with a redundant system, but also with a spare parts kit, right on board. So if something did happen, even on the secondary system, you can still do that easy repair as you're sitting there. And we actually just released here in April a new system for farmer product as well, a new dual redundant system that fits into the same, I would call the same space as a standard reefer equipment. So you could take it off of any container and put this unit on, and you have a dual redundant system for transport of most of farmer product is transiting between 2 to 25 degrees Celsius, so just above freezing, somewhere to room temperature kind of application. Cool. And in that case, you have this dual redundant system right out of the box, and you can just easily swap it out from a different container. So we tried to make it match exactly. So it's it takes about 30 minutes to swap that unit out, and then you're up and running with a dual system for your high value product as well. So.
And in addition to that, I guess you guys also offer that remote monitoring, so you can provide data both on the ambient and the cargo temps in the units, as well as the location of the shipment. I mean, that's got to be a great option for a lot of people.
Yeah, so we offer those systems directly, attached to our equipment, from the factory here, both with GSM and satellite. So you can actually get some connectivity even on the vessel when it's on the ocean as well. So some visibility there with, which is helpful to also help convince some, especially pharmaceutical customers, to allow their product, right, their very valuable cargo, to go on a vessel for 4 to 6 weeks. I mean, they want to know what's going on with that product at pretty much all times. And we also have a team of engineers here that works with external party providers. So if there's a different device that maybe a fleet operator is using across their fleet, we also can communicate to them through Modbus protocol to allow them to directly read the information from our system, even to the point of being able to do things like remote set point changes and things like that, if that's what they want to do and want to see. So that's been pretty successful. And there's been a complete, there are many providers in that space right now. So we try to be as flexible as possible, both with our own equipment, but also being able to communicate with others. So.
Nice. And I'll say on that same line of thinking, we have a lot of clients that work within the food manufacturing space. And I know you have your quick thaw containers, your Q2Us. Maybe talk a little bit about that too, because I know on that piece, you can start a delay on the thawing unit, as well as you can record that data for food safety records. So maybe talk a little bit about how that system works, and then also where you've seen, I don't know if you want to talk about maybe a use case, but how you've seen that really benefit some clients.
Yeah, certainly. I can definitely share a customer success story, but the very general concept is, again, this is one niche we identified. So this is a non-transport application, but used at processing facilities. So typically someone who is receiving large quantities of beef, poultry, pork, some product that they're going to then process or change in some way as part of their production process. And so, we've seen, certainly during the pandemic, of course, we saw a lot of product being, unfortunately, thrown away. Like, when employees unfortunately fell ill, companies had to shut down, and any fresh product that they had kind of had to be discarded. So there has been a growing investment in having some more frozen inventories for purposes of just being able to kind of more easily regulate that production process and make it more smooth. But also, to be honest, in some cases, especially with poultry, if you take a look at what happens with poultry prices when they fluctuate based on outbreaks of bird flu and other avian flu and other things like that, you can actually take advantage, some companies, of that price difference at that time if they have enough inventory. So that is something that is also being looked at as an advantage. But our system then is there to rapidly thaw that product so you can use it in your production, and to do it on a daily basis. So anywhere up to 10,000 kilos, 22,000 pounds of product in a daily cycle to allow your production line to keep moving. Typically, it's then put into a grinder or some other processes almost immediately from the thawing process. But it really allows them to move from an a standard air tempering, or a standard water tempering solution. And the standard air tempering solution is normally, hey, we're going to put it in a room that's going to be at a certain temperature, and we're going to wait 5 days for it to thaw. And it will thaw. It'll just take time. It'll take, you're taking up the space, and you're obviously then having to bring in the next product and kind of constantly having product moving through those tempering rooms. A watering tempering process is similar, except for you're spraying warm water on the product to try to speed up that process. So recently, one of our customers moved from the air tempering solution, which was taking between, I believe, 5 to 7 days of their process, and then moved all the way down to that single day kind of tempering process, which really allowed them to do two things. It really allowed them to have a lot more control, because it's a very controlled system that we use with high volume airflow, and constantly measuring surface temperature and core temperature to make sure the product's not overcooked at the surface, and it will always be at the right core temperature at the middle for processing later. But because they were able to do that, they could predict and control their production much more smoothly, because they knew exactly when the product would be ready. But they also were able to, and as I said, reduce the space that they were using, reduce the energy that they were using, and just also be able to react very quickly. If they got a customer demand for product to be delivered, let's say in 2 to 3 days, they didn't have to wait 7 days first for the product to thaw and then say, okay, now we can start working on it. So it gave them, flexibility and predictability in the production process, and consistently coming out with that proper temperature for both their surface and core to allow them to do the processing as efficiently as possible as well.
Well, your efforts aren't going unrecognized in the industry. I think you guys last year in 23 were awarded the top food processing solutions provider by the Food and Beverage Technology Review around that piece, right? So that's nice reinforcement that you guys are headed the right direction there. I think one of the stories I used to know about you was that you had products on all 7 continents, I think, right? Still,
yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And also, I thought always one of the coolest stories was that I remember you had a unit that was taking ice samples and core samples that they were looking at, studying the gas that was trapped within the ice to study the atmosphere at these different intervals of time throughout history.
Right.
Being shipped around to different universities to study that, to be able to get a better indication of what the atmosphere was like during that time. So it's not just yes, there's commercial application here, but your products are also used in some really cool other environments where extreme temperatures or extreme conditions may be at play. And there's really not a lot of great other solutions other than what you guys have managed to create.
Yeah, in particular, that application was for the National Science Foundation and done under the U.S. Antarctic program. And we worked closely with the prime contractor at the time on that to help them safely transport the gas, which needed to be at minus 25 Celsius or below at all times, so that they could bring it back to the National Ice Core Lab in Denver and then do that analysis, which was spanning back a few 100,000 years, if I'm remembering properly. But again, yeah, that is how we ended up with equipment on Antarctica, where you kind of would think, why do you need any sort of freezer equipment on Antarctica? You can just open the door. But when the science determines that you need that kind of calibrated control, we were there and we built for that project as well generator sets that actually would auto start all the way down to minus 50 Celsius. So they would be ready, warm, the batteries would be warm, there'd be enough cold cranking amps, and the fuel would be warm enough that if there was a loss of power when they were being stored, the core samples were being stored at either the South Pole base or McMurdo Station, which is the American base in Antarctica, before shipment out. If that happened, they would still automatically start even in those ultra low temperatures. So it proved to be a very interesting application for that as well. And some of our other systems that we talked about earlier, the ultra low systems, are also used for testing of products and things like that. So if you have a product that has to start at minus 40, minus 50 yourself, and you put it in this container, you can precondition it, soak it, and then see what's going to happen with that. So
I mean, it's not quite, but almost like selling ice to Eskimos, right? You guys have actually pulled it off. Where I don't know that anybody else can say that's the case.
Yeah, we were very happy that we were able to do it and make it all work. And yeah. I think there were millions and millions of dollars worth of effort, right, in each one of those containers, and certainly a lot of scientists and a lot of people working very hard, staying down there over the winter, right, to make sure all this was going well. So we wanted to make sure those efforts were not in vain, and that product was going to make it back, and those samples are going to make it back where they needed to go. So
very cool. And I know too, even on the talk about extreme conditions, the military side, you've developed some specialized 10 and 20 foot refrigerated containers for armed forces around the world. Everybody from United States, Hungarian, Austrian Defense Forces, Swedish, United Nations. And a lot for the storage and transport of food and medicine in the field there. How has that has some of the extreme conditions under which you had to create those types of units helped lead innovation for you in other areas? Or would you say it's the reverse? I don't know if you had one that kind of has led the other.
So we did a few projects. So those primarily would have been around 10 to 15 years ago, where we were just coming out of, the Great Recession, right? And things were just kind of starting to pick up a little more. And we noticed that there was some demand for refurbishment at that time or not refurbishment, I'd say replenishment of effective supplies, especially for military forces that were operating around the world, both, in active military theaters, but oftentimes in peacekeeping operations, right? There to just support the local population, provide food, in some cases shelter as well, but really to be there as, peacekeepers. And in that case, we were contacted by the Australian Defence to develop and replace their perishable goods storage applications. So we're talking, in this case, either down to about minus 20 C or 0, minus 18 C or 0F applications for frozen, and then some above frozen for prepared foods, even to the point of building in certain storage applications for already prepared chicken and things like that when they were using them at field kitchens. And those were definitely great learning experiences for our team. Our engineers really came through. We had a whole host of tests that we had to meet, as you mentioned, including vibration tests, radiated emissions tests, conducted emissions tests, high temperature tests, low temperature tests, solar load tests. So we were really putting the equipment through the ringer, if you want to say that. And that did help us with some later applications. We took a lot of lessons that we learned about, especially vibration, really severe vibration, where they are putting it on a truck that is, dropping easily, at least 6 inches between, each tire rotation. And we took those and applied them to our general products, even though, they weren't necessarily needed for normal vibration shock that we see. We said, well, these are ways that we can improve that product. Same with the radiated emissions. If we saw certain things and certain devices that might, be in a certain band that even though commercial is acceptable, we often then would take and say, well, at some point this regulation is probably going to come into the commercial space from the military space, so we're going to go ahead and make that adjustment with that piece of equipment and just say we're going to be ahead of the curve. So, it's less work for us to do later when somebody does kind of implement some of those same things on the commercial side. So yeah, definitely great learning experiences. but also, really good to work in those cases with, the teams at the various military sites, including the full Quartermaster Corps, for example, in Australian Defence, and similar teams in the Swedish Defence, to just make sure that allied governments were getting the equipment they needed and how they needed it. And interestingly enough, obviously a lot of it tied into the NSN system as well, where it just allows for some flexibility of parts supply and things like that on the back end as well for a lot of these countries. So
very cool. Yeah, it's oftentimes we have companies that they're looking for how do they expand and grow, whether they're, it's not just they're looking for a transition. It's okay, how do we just become more cash flow positive? How do we maybe make acquisitions? Where do we grow that? And a lot of times they're trying to say, well, we make one part or one product, and so we think we need to make additional parts or additional products to get additional sales channels. And I think your company is a great example of, well, you've expanded on the same kind of a product, right? In terms of, hey, it's a refrigerated container, tank, or otherwise. You've done a great job of identifying applications in other industries. So you can stay kind of core to what you guys really know and do the best of anybody out there, but then you can open it up to new industries and maybe start to make design changes that, to your point, start to lead where everybody else is at currently, to take advantage of future market conditions where people go, this is the product that we need to now use. So do you have any advice for other business owners or people who are there where they say, okay, look, I'm looking for growth, maybe it's additional channels, but you've done a really great job of being able to go find areas to expand into. Is, some of that just luck, but I know it's not all that, right? Do you attribute that to, hey, we're really engaged with trade shows and with having conversations with new industries that maybe we're not as familiar with, just to get some exposure and evaluate, is there a space for us here? Or how do you go about trying to figure out new channels that you want to open up? And maybe that leads you into new products as well, or modification of existing lines.
Yeah, I think if you looked at us, 15, 20 years ago, we would have been very focused on just a few industries, and we were delivering some equipment in that space, especially to Europe and East Asia, I would say. So most of our sales were not in the US. About 85% of our business was export focused. And that continued to about 2015. But even in that time frame, we were pushing forward into the oil and gas market. And we identified a niche where we said, well, we can see certain regulatory trends, and so because of our tie-ins, especially to the dangerous goods industry, we're also very tied into certain other safety-minded kind of regulatory industries that we touch upon, and we could see that trend was coming very quickly. There had been a few incidents obviously on some oil rigs and other things that were not the best thing for the companies there, and they were looking for ways to basically expand their safety footprint on board a lot of these locations. So we tried to stay, through industry partners as well as through, as you mentioned, publications, conferences, things like that, in touch with what we think may be coming regulatory requirements, and that usually leads us to a possible product development. But at the same time, we also have to, be sure that we have enough knowledge, and we don't want to be afraid of going into a market, right? We say, okay, this is something we want to do, but we do take the time then to get that product knowledge in-house, go through some iterations of development, and then look and see, at the same time we're doing kind of a canvassing of customers in that area and saying, what do the customers want? Because the most important thing is you can develop the greatest product. You might think it's the greatest product in the world, but if you haven't done your research, if you haven't looked and said, what are the customers asking for, or what do we, with high confidence, believe they will be asking for in the future, then it doesn't matter how great that product is, it just won't go off the shelf. So at the same time as you're doing that product development, you have to have this kind of interface and back and forth, and that might be a 12 or 24 month period, really. So it's kind of a typical turnaround for us to put in a kind of fully new product in the space. You want to have that constant feedback of, hey, this is where we're headed, this is where we're going, and we are lucky that we work with a lot of multinational companies too that tend to touch on several different industries as well, and so sometimes we can leverage relationships we have with existing customers into getting some context in that specific new industry as well, to have a sounding board, I guess, for what we're doing, and say, hey, will this be something that you guys would look for in 2 years or something like that. So we know that we can be there with that product when they need it. And that happened in the oil and gas industry. It happened in the pharmaceutical industry. It happened with our newer versions of these thawing systems that you mentioned as well. So, and we're doing it now, another new product rollout in October, November timeframe for our bulk liquid products for tank containers, where we're looking and saying, how do we make the product lighter, smaller, more energy efficient, just in trying to respond to where the industry is generally moving as well.
And that's a good lead into great advice, by the way, from that perspective. And I think even an example of that may be, Merck and some of the other pharmaceutical companies, I think setting some of those goals around emissions and how do we cut down on that. And to your point, right, switching from air freight to ocean transport, you having a solution for them, looking forward in that sense, gave you an opportunity to continue to expand into a market that had capacity for your products there. So that helps. On the tank container side, I think there's some interesting pieces there for growth. You were talking, I saw in another interview about lithium electrolytes and some of the acids that are used in the microprocessor etching being one of those cases where your tanks are able to be used. Maybe talk a little bit more about that and the growth that you guys have seen on more of that tech side.
Yeah, and I think that's a great example of being in the right place at the right time with the right product. In that case, it was probably not something we specifically pushed. We just had a good product that was well known for temperature controlled applications on those tanks. But as you saw that investment, go up, especially in the U.S., but also in Europe and in China on the export side. I think of the lithium electrolytes, for example. You saw the import side in the EU and U.S. be heavily invested in as they were governments were looking to spur electric vehicle production. So as they were doing that, of course, you need the lithium-ion batteries for that, and so those electrolytes become a very hot commodity, and they have to be transported at certain temperatures for quality purposes, so that when they get there to the site, they're able to be used in those final battery production sites. So that was something where, maybe sometimes you do get a little bit of luck, but it was based on the fact that we had a good and reliable product. We had a service network that could support the use of that product across Asia, Europe, and US, and people knew that. So we had done a lot of work, I would say, to get the goodwill and the reputation that people would trust in using that equipment from us. So that really kind of set us on the path for success there. And similarly, in the the ramp up of semiconductor microprocessor manufacturing that we're seeing going on around the world, and particularly with some geopolitical tensions, incentivizing, I would say, new production site installations and building of factories. I think that has really given rise to a new and more complex supply chain that existed, for many years, and that does require then active temperature control of some of those products that are used in that process. And we've been able to also provide our equipment for that for some large chemical companies that are supporting that, and then also directly to some of those manufacturers of that, the actual chips themselves. So
that's good. That's really good. So how are you guys seeing kind of things change? I know there's some regulations are trying to shift towards some new refrigerant models, and with Europe, the F-gas, concerns there. What's the traction like? Are you feeling like people are going in a good direction? There's good cohesion amongst you and others in that space to try and find a solution that works for everybody without putting too much, price strain on who the customers of your products would be long-term as well?
So there's probably, for our equipment, two answers to that. And one has to do with the stationary equipment and one has to do with the transport applications. So for the stationary equipment, I would say there's a pretty good consensus on where things are going. And obviously you have a piece of equipment that's sitting in one jurisdiction. It has to abide by the rules in that jurisdiction. So that is more strict in Europe with the F-gas regulations. They're also now struggling with some of the discussions around PFAS, which is used in a lot of the synthetic refrigerants. So that is something that's coming down the road as well, where if there are restrictions placed there, then it's going to also severely limit the kind of products that can be used. So a lot of the more preferred low global warming potential GWP solutions that are being used now are with and do include PFAS. There's some synthetic solutions. So we'll see where that heads. There's been a large investment by a lot of companies in CO2 as a refrigerant. The only thing about CO2 though is that it does have a pretty high power consumption. So you have a trade-off as to what contributory factor you would have of global warming from a possible leak versus the amount of energy you need to run that system. And especially in higher ambient conditions, the energy trade-off there is pretty difficult, meaning that the likelihood of a leak versus that, you can say maybe 10% is contributing toward global warming from a possible leak, and 90% is from the energy consumption. So that's not something we have really looked at now until there's maybe some new technology that makes that work more efficiently on the compressor side. But we are looking at lower GWP solutions for most of our applications. And in many cases, that means we're offering two solutions, one that typically will be used in areas outside of the EU, and one that will be used in the EU. And the EU is kind of leading the charge. But we have to make sure, of course, that we're not placing ourselves at some disadvantage. As you mentioned, if there's a very expensive new replacement that's used in a stationary application in the EU, but you can't get it in the US, of course, we're going to have a second option that works in the US or works in Asia, where we're shipping that equipment to. And then you have the really complex piece, which is the transport application. We have one piece of equipment transiting all over the world, going into different countries that have different regulations around refrigerant. And how do you supply, how do you make sure that there's going to be a supply of the refrigerant for your system in case something did happen? And that's really the tough nut to crack. And that we've had recently some meetings here and generated a report through the Container Owners Association, which is a group of the steamship lines and leasing companies. So largely the largest control of all the containers in the world are through the actual vessel operators, which own their own containers, or leasing companies, which typically lease to those vessel operators or to actual shippers. And those two groups are very interested in, hey, what is going to happen with this equipment? Because I'm expecting to get, let's just call it at least 12 years of life when I go to invest. And if I buy something now and in 5 years, I can't use that equipment because the refrigerant's been discontinued or not allowed to use in Europe, so I can only use it outside of Europe. It makes my logistics very complicated, right? So they are pushing for solutions, and we are working as an industry on those solutions. Klinge ourselves, we can innovate in almost every other facet except for the refrigerant without kind of a bigger movement from the industry, because we are a smaller manufacturer, as I mentioned, niche manufacturer, and we could put a fantastic refrigerant with very low GWP in our system, but if it gets to a country that doesn't have that source of refrigerant, then we have a major problem, especially if it's transporting something like a high value pharmaceutical or a dangerous good, where you're going to have, a possible large incident or loss or something like that. So we want to make sure we're following the industry in that sense and leading in other spaces. But we need also, the service points, the terminals, the vessel operators, they all need training on the new types of refrigerants that are out there as well. So it is going to be a consolidated industry effort that comes out over the next, 3 to 5 years, I think, to respond and move forward with some solutions for lower GWT applications. They're laid out in this report that we've done. But, it is a transitional report, and eventually, hopefully, in probably a 10+ year time frame, looking at getting to that, what we hope will be kind of that final set of refrigerants that's used around the world, just because it is a process, and that is basically saying, 3 to 5 years of development of new types of equipment, right, that will be able to be used, and then putting them out to market, and then letting the other equipment kind of slowly move out of the marketplace as well. So
yeah, well, if anybody who's had to empty and recharge a heat pump even at their house recently, right? Like the cost of refrigerant alone is pretty sizable, right? So yeah, I can imagine how it impacts your industry too. So you touch on that too. As a multinational company, right? You have an office in Denmark. A lot of people have said, hey, trying to find out how do you keep culture going? How do you keep people engaged when they're maybe a remote or even a hybrid worker? How have you guys managed to, keep your groups connected on different continents, essentially? So between who you have in Denmark and over here in the States.
Yeah, so we have had basically a partner company in Denmark that we work with on the engineering side, and some of our spares provisioning as well. And we're obviously in constant contact. It gets a lot easier when you have things like Teams and other things like that that help you to have that communication and feel like you're not completely sitting on an island. Even though technically I think they're in Copenhagen, so they are on an island. But at the same time, it certainly allows for that much easier transfer of normal. It's a much easier kind of normal conversational tone, right? So you're not just having an email sent or going way back faxes sent, right? You're having a real communication, a real conversation, and that just allows for that and facilitates that sense of, I think, of belonging a lot more than just sitting there, in a remote office, which can be, I would imagine, a little bit daunting of a prospect. So
yeah, I bet. So do you have a favorite story overall of any kind of time, or either a product that you guys developed or a use case for one of your products? Maybe I already stole it with one of the two examples that I used. Were kind of my favorites earlier, but
yeah,
anything stands out to you?
Well, I mean, I think certainly the Ice Core project that you mentioned was one of the favorites here from folks, because we really felt like we were doing something very interesting and unique, but at the same time, just helping to advance the understanding of our world, right? So helping to understand what has changed over all these years and what could we possibly do better. That's always a very important thing. Yeah, we've also recently delivered some equipment for blast freezing, for example, to Ukraine. That was a good project for us to try to help out some of the people in need there in Ukraine. We've done other projects locally here with the York Food Bank and other things like that kind of try to show a little bit of the other side of our business, where we're trying to do not just the commercial side of things, but typically systems that are that are going to be able to be used by charities and things like that. We initially, after the hurricane in Haiti, the earthquake in Haiti, had sent down some equipment there as well to help with some of those relief efforts. We try to do things like that, and we worked with the Red Cross as well on some projects in Africa, and we're looking to also be involved, obviously, for any planning purposes for pandemic relief, in the future, right? We got through this one, and a lot of people, unfortunately, went through a lot of really tough times during it, and hopefully we learned some things. And if there is a readiness plan for the next one, we definitely want to be part of that as well, because I think everybody agrees we probably could have done a few things faster. So if we know what the playbook is now, then hopefully we can also be ready for that and ready to respond. And I know our team was very proud of the response we were able to generate here, but we all knew too, hey, if we had a few things more lined up even on our side, it wasn't just, it was a collective delay, I would say, from everybody. Nobody knew what was going to happen or how it was going to happen. Now we at least have been through it, and hopefully next time we can handle it a lot better. So
I'd be interested to learn a little bit about interesting, because you're a third generation business, and would you have any advice for another maybe multi-generational business was transferring their company down from one generation to the other? Is there anything there? Because we've seen sometimes that can be a little challenging. So would you have any piece of advice for anybody who wants to transfer business down to somebody else in the family?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I haven't thought about it in a while, since we had done our initial planning around that about 10, 12 years ago now. So it's been some time that I've been kind of here at the helm, but at the same time, I think there's two main pieces of that. One is, as you're talking about, it's generation, right? So you're working with family, right? So I think the first thing is to understand how to work with your family. And that is to say, you want to always remember that you're family, right? Because things in business, especially and for all those that don't work with family members, understand that there are tensions in business all the time, right? Between bosses, employees, between colleagues, even between salespeople and customers, that where a lot of frustration can boil over sometimes. And at the end of the day, you have to be able to think about yourself sitting down at the dinner table with this person, right? And saying, how are we going to go on as the relationship that we should have, without letting all this stuff cloud that piece of it. And I think my father was very good with that with his father. And I have tried to carry that same lesson home. And we can have it's not that you don't have a heated discussion. It's just that at the end of that heated discussion, especially if you're wrong, you are going to have to, take that back and apologize and move on and figure out how to, make sure you're having that relationship, because in particular, if it's a generational item, then you probably are dealing with grandkids and other things too. So not to let that piece of it, that business piece of it, overtake the family piece. It's a family business. The family comes first. It's not a business family. So even though I would say we are, of course, with the other team members here, consider ourselves also a family. But when you talk about a multi-generational business, you're talking about a family business, right? So, and the second piece, I would just say, get good advice, right? So when you're doing the succession planning, when you're doing any sort of other planning, when you're doing, estate planning, all sorts of things that tie into these things, which are very complex and sometimes difficult things to talk about, make sure you have the right advice, because it's very easy to do things the wrong way. And don't consider yourself a financial expert or a, business restructuring expert if you're not. I mean, maybe some people are. I'm not. So I certainly am, willing to be humble enough to say, hey, I need help, and I need help from experts, and that's important to kind of think about as well. That is really a piece of it that many people just try to do it, as simply as they know how to do it, and that often can lead them into other issues as well. So
that's great advice.
Yeah, I think that's terrific advice, and we've seen situations where it's been 7 generations. We recently talked to someone who 7 generations dropped down. So it's always a interesting situation where transferring it down from one group to the next, it can be challenging. But to your point, is your family, families, it's really important to keep that in front of your mind. And then the advice piece, we would say, is extremely important, because we're all experts in certain spaces, and that type of transition is very quite valuable. So yeah. I would say that's a thanks for going back in time here and bringing that back and giving some people some advice on that piece.
The other thing I'll just say to that too, and Allan, you made a great point, is if you keep that family piece kind of the core when you're making other decisions, you keep the business piece kind of business on its own, right? And you look at it more healthily from a business perspective of, is this good for the business? Was it the right decision for the business, or wasn't it? And I think a lot of times where I tell people, I say, the hardest thing everybody says is to have a business that you start and turn it into a successful one. I think it's more to have that, to pass it down to other generations and have it continue to grow, right? And you guys have been able to do that. This other client that Mike's talking about that's done it for 7 generations was able to. And the challenge, I think, is when you have good people with good core values sometimes that say, I know that another generation is going to want to put their mark on this business. They may see opportunities or want to take paths that maybe the generation prior to them didn't always necessarily think was going to be the path, or maybe there's new technology or new systems or equipment that they want to bring in, which to the generations prior to them is kind of like, hey, that's not how we do it here. That's not how we grew. And so I think it takes both generations looking at it from that perspective sometimes too, to say, hey, let's give it a try. Let's test the waters, almost that, that agile approach versus a waterfall one. We're going to try, we're going to see if it works. And if it doesn't, we're not going to kill each other over it. We're just going to move towards something else that we think we'll get there. So I think that's a testament to people who, like you said, keep the family piece as the core component, and then recognize that you're trying to move the business in the right direction for the business, not just because it's somebody's ego that wants to take credit for the success of it. But
I think you can realize that mentoring can go both ways, right? Mentoring is not only from typically the older generation to the younger, like you would think about, but it also can go both ways. And I think that's been a really good balance that we've been able to strike here, is just to say, okay, we're going to be open to looking at things from both perspectives, right? So to understand why things have been done in a certain way for so long, and then understand why things might be different now and might be a good idea to change. But you have to have both those pieces, because otherwise somebody may come in with a whole bunch of new and great ideas that they think are great, but there are really good reasons not to do them, right? So they probably already, half of them have probably already been tried, but they may think, hey, I need to change this and this and this, and it's not, change for change's sake is not, the right way to go either.
Yeah. So listen, it's been fantastic having you on. 2 last questions before we let you go. One is, where can we find you coming up? Right, I know that you are on the road a ton, so you guys are at a lot of great trade shows, and I think that gives people a real opportunity to be able to see your, products and get a chance to ask you questions about how that might be implemented in their business model. Is there anything that you have on the calendar right now that you can speak to where people might be able to find you?
Sure, yeah. So we will be fully celebrating our 40-year anniversary here in the U.S. At Intermodal in Rotterdam in November. So we'll be there for the full conference and exhibition space there, which is typically reefer manufacturers, container manufacturers, logistics companies, leasing companies, people in the industry for just general kind of intermodal transport. We'll also be this year attending and looking to possibly exhibit the following year at CPHI in Milan. So that'll be for CDMO, so contract development manufacturing organizations that work in the pharma space. So the companies that typically are contracted to produce the final product once it's been through all the trials and approvals as well. We're heading then into January at IPPE, which is a food production conference and large exhibition down in Atlanta. And then following through in the next few months after that to Logi Pharma, which is a big pharma logistics conference in Lyon, as well as our tank container HITCO group, International Tank Container Organization group, will be taking part in Transport Logistics Munich in May. So those are a few of the ones coming up, but we do try to keep in touch with all the customers through as many of those as we can as well. So yeah.
No excuse to not find you on a global scale. You guys are going to be basically everywhere.
Yeah.
So pretty cool. Yeah. And then I guess the last piece is just, if there's somebody who, obviously we've talked a little bit about some of the big pharma and some of the larger entities and governments that are using your products, but that's not the only end users, right? No. So for those people who are a business owner who's curious about learning a little bit more about, hey, is this an application that I could integrate with my business? Can I even just talk to somebody and figure out, is there benefits that I could, receive from utilizing one of these products versus what I'm doing currently, especially I'll say maybe around the food manufacturing piece. What's the best way that somebody can get in touch with you guys? Should they visit the website, just reach out directly that way? And then also maybe just, is there any key areas where you say, hey, if you're in this space right now and you haven't taken a look at these solutions, we've seen success in a couple of customers who have reached out to us and, found success by using these products versus their old methodology.
Yeah, so it is true. We do have a large number of our customers are kind of the bigger multinational customers, but we do find some success, especially with the quick thaw equipment. It's kind of smaller production facilities as well. They're just looking to, they might only have one site and they might have one shift, but they're looking to say, how can I improve, my throughput and flexibility, as we talked about, predictability of inventory readiness, I guess I would say. So that's been a pretty good success point. And the easiest way is to go to the website. There's a talk to a specialist form there. It's very easy to fill out. You can call the telephone number, of course. If you're on the right time zone, depending who's watching this. If they're somewhere in Singapore, then the form may be a little bit easier. But we do get back to people as quickly as possible with that. And there's a ton of information available on the website as well for just some easy to watch videos, kind of instructional things as well that can help to kind of give an indication of, hey, is this right for me, before you even have to technically speak to someone and engage or leave an email address or anything like that. So, but that is the typical way we see folks that would approach about some possible improvements to their existing facilities, for example.
Awesome. Well, listen, it's been exciting to see you guys grow over the years, and excited to see that continual growth and how it heads into the future. And certainly appreciate you taking time out today of what we know is a very busy schedule to jump on and give us a little bit more background on the company. So thanks for being a guest.
I appreciate the opportunity. I guess I should tell the website is www.klingecorp.com. So yeah, probably would be helpful to mention that. But yeah, thank you very much.
And we'll put a link on here as well for everybody too, so that they can go ahead and have direct access from there.
Sounds good. Well, thank you very much. Appreciate it. Take care.